Sometimes if I return to the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism after a bit of time away, I look at it and I'm like, is that it? Is that all that's there? I think it's just because I spend so much time in this lovely community I have here chatting about shared experiences with other autistic people. I also read books about autism. I read through various research papers. I'm just kind of very immersed in autism, you know? It's a special interest, can you tell? And it just feels a bit like the DSM-5 is missing some really key autistic traits, some things that are mentioned again and again that are almost integral to the autistic experience. Obviously, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and not everyone's going to be exactly the same, but they're just things that come up again and again, and I'm just surprised that they're not there every time. So I want to discuss some of those traits here with you today. I thought it might be fun. It might also be helpful if you're considering the fact that you might be autistic. I know just looking at the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, it can feel very cold and sterile, and it can be difficult to like see a real person in that. Like, who is that actually describing sometimes? While the things that I'm discussing today are not in the DSM-5, or at least not explicitly, some of them are kind of alluded to in the DSM-5. I'm not just pulling them out of thin air. What is thin air, actually, when you think about it, as opposed to thick air? Is it like a humidity thing? These are not just things that I've decided are traits, these are things that are discussed all the time by academics, and a lot of autistic charities offer support for some of these things. So they are real. It's important to remember that you don't even have to relate to everything on the DSM-5 in order to be diagnosed as autistic. You have to fit those first 3 social related criteria, but then you don't need to hit all of the traits in the next category in order to be diagnosed. So just because you don't relate to some of these doesn't necessarily mean that you're not autistic. Equally, if you relate to a few of them doesn't necessarily mean that you are autistic. A lot of autistic traits are kind of like normal parts of the human experience, but with the volume turned way up. However, if you do relate to a lot of them, or like all of them, you might want to look into the fact that you could potentially be autistic. A hell of a lot of autistic people are undiagnosed, and kind of the older you are, the more likely people in your generation are to have not been diagnosed, to have not been picked up. The prevalence of autism in 1966 was thought to be 4.5 children per 10,000. Obviously very, very different to the stats we have today. A reminder that I'm not a medical professional. If you are struggling with your mental health, you should probably go and see somebody who is a medical professional. Although autism itself is a neurodevelopmental condition, it's not a mental illness, there isn't a treatment or a cure, but autistic people can be more likely to struggle with things that are treatable, like depression and OCD. So number 1 autistic trait that I'm surprised again and again to see is not in the DSM-5 is perfectionism. This came up again and again in my own autism assessment, and according to the people who diagnosed me, they notice a pattern of perfectionism again and again in the autistic people who come through them.
So today's going to be all English all day, tomorrow's going to be guitar practice all day because I have my ensemble and solo piece next week. I mean, what if I die or get really ill and then I just don't perform my best?
As early as Leo Kanner's work in 1943, autistic people have been described as finding failure unbearable. There has been some suggestion that this perfectionism might occur in autistic people due to cognitive inflexibility, so kind of the way we're quite black and white in our thinking sometimes, things are either right or they're wrong. And the DSM-5 does actually include rigid thinking patterns in the criteria. Apparently even for typical, in quotation marks, adults, inflexibility has been linked to perfectionism. If you're wondering if this describes you and you're not sure, this one quote really resonated with me. I found it in a study about autism and perfectionism. The tendency to believe there is a perfect solution to every problem, that doing something perfectly, i.e. mistake-free, is not only possible but also necessary, and that even minor mistakes will have serious consequences. That describes my whole entire life, basically. I can tie myself up in mental knots thinking about something. If I have to make a decision, I go round and round and round. I feel like somewhere hidden in the universe there is a perfect right answer, and if I just think long enough, it will come to me and everything will be amazing forevermore. Happily ever after. And I can do this with even really small decisions if I'm not careful about my thinking. I've said it before, when I'm picking out clothes for my son, it can literally be down to the pair of socks and underwear. and there's no clear answer. Obviously, there's no real right answer. I'll go to reach out for a pair of underwear, and then my brain's like, what if the other one's the right one? And then my hand can move at the last second, and then I just get this sinking feeling about whichever decision I make that it's maybe not the right one. It's also been suggested that autistic people might overestimate other people's expectations of them, so might have high socially prescribed perfectionism. I feel like this definitely describes me. I have a video about my autistic burnout story and how I got obsessed with studying and trying to get perfect grades towards the end of high school. I feel like a lot of that was pride. It was wanting other people to say, you did the right thing, you got the best grades you could have possibly got, which was 100%. That's what I wanted to get in every single exam, and got quite distressed if I wasn't hitting that. It also might maybe explain why I hate being watched while I do something, and I know a lot of other autistic people can feel that way as well. The perfectionism could also sometimes be to do with literal thinking, like if someone says you need to put in 110%, we may try to actually put in 110%, even though that's impossible. I remember in school teachers saying things like, if you're not miserable while you're studying for this exam, you're obviously not working hard enough, and I definitely took that to heart and made myself miserable. Little trigger warning for eating disorders here, but we know there is a link between anorexia particularly, and I think some other eating disorders as well, and perfectionism, and we know that there is a link between anorexia and autism. I think up to like 25%, up to a quarter of people with anorexia could also be autistic. Wouldn't be surprised if it was maybe more than that as well, with just the number of people who are undiagnosed. I read this really interesting article on the British Psychological Society recently. I can only apologize to patients where I didn't recognize their autism, and that article was focused on working with eating disorder patients. So number 2, one of the major complaints that autistic people have about the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria is that, obviously it's a book about mental disorders. It calls it autism spectrum disorder. Some people like to say autism spectrum condition instead. It looks at autism in a very negative light, and in order to get the diagnosis, you have to sit there and talk about your life and your life experiences in a very negative way in order to hit the criteria. And unfortunately, most of us can do that because we have had a lot of negative experiences to do with being autistic, but it hasn't necessarily been all negative, This is why it really surprises me that this particular trait is not on here, because it's probably the time when I would say most autistic people, or at least many autistic people, both feel and look their most disordered. And that is autistic meltdowns. There is nothing really in the DSM-5 that alludes to autistic meltdowns. Now, you could say that's because not every autistic person will experience autistic meltdowns, but as I say, you don't have to hit every box on the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria to be diagnosed as autistic. And autistic meltdowns have been described, again, for basically as long as autism has been described. So in 1943, Kanner published these case studies where he looked at autistic children. The first one is about a boy called Donald, who grew up to be Donald Triplett, who was the first person to ever be diagnosed as autistic. He only passed away last year. And in his case study of Donald, he wrote, when interfered with, he had temper tantrums, during which he was destructive. He was dreadfully fearful of being spanked, but could not associate his misconduct with his punishment. So obviously we know now that autistic meltdowns are not temper tantrums as they are described here, although if you look at any video online where an autistic meltdown has been uploaded by a parent of a child, which I find to be very inappropriate, but the comments will basically all be, they're just having a tantrum, you just need to discipline them more. So yes, some people do still think this way. Some people are still hanging out with Kanner in 1943. There probably are worse people they could be hanging out with in 1943, not gonna lie. Personally, I think rather than thinking about meltdowns as temper tantrums, we're better thinking of them as panic attacks, so something that's uncontrollable for the person once it's started, but there are things you can do to prevent them from getting to that place. If you're not sure what an autistic meltdown is, this is where an autistic person temporarily loses control of their behavior. So this could be to do with them feeling like they've lost a sense of control. Maybe something goes wrong in an interest that they're intensely working on. Interruptions, as it describes here with Donald, can be very uncomfortable for autistic people too, so that could contribute. Sensory things, sensory overwhelm, too much going on in your environment. And also changes to your routine, things happening that you don't expect. In a meltdown, an autistic person's brain just kind of short circuits. It's just like too much information. They can't cope anymore. And it could present as anger. It could present as shouting and screaming. It could present as crying and hyperventilating and rocking in a corner. There is also a more internalized version of an autistic meltdown called shutdown, where an autistic person may become unable to speak or unable to say very much, and they kind of just withdraw and retreat into themselves. Someone on Reddit referred to this as statue mode, which I quite liked. Some people who are higher masking may be able to kind of postpone a meltdown, so kind of temporarily internalize it, and then once they're in a safe environment, may be able to then let the emotions out. You'll hear quite a lot that autistic children can behave very differently at school to how they behave at home, because while they're at school, they're internalizing the emotions, and once they're safe and at home, those emotions come out. But for some autistic people, maybe particularly if they don't feel safe in their home life, they may just internalize all the time, and you can imagine how kind of holding those big emotions in, while it may have less of an impact on the people around them, it can be very detrimental to a person's mental health, and obviously it means they're going unsupported because people don't necessarily know that there's something wrong. I wonder what you think. I wonder if you have any theories or any knowledge about why meltdowns are not mentioned in the DSM-5. The closest we get to a mention of a meltdown is extreme distress at small changes, but obviously extreme distress is not very specific, and that's just one situation that could potentially cause a meltdown. It doesn't describe, sensory overload or anything like that. The one thing that I do think is quite dangerous about this is that we know that quite a lot of autistic people are misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Young autistic people can be misdiagnosed with emerging unstable personality disorder as well. And while meltdowns are not included on the diagnostic criteria for autism, what is number 9 on the criteria for borderline personality disorder, it's inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, e.g. frequent displays of temper, constant anger, recurrent physical fights. And then it also mentions emotional instability and anxiety. And similarly, if you look at the diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder, it mentions becoming irritated and agitated as well. So I don't know, do you think this lack of acknowledgement of autistic meltdowns in the diagnostic criteria for autism makes it more likely for an autistic person to be diagnosed with a mental illness or a personality disorder that they don't have? Obviously that can be quite serious. You could be given medication, and both of these things can be stigmatizing as well. So number 3, closely linked to autistic meltdowns and shutdowns, we have autistic burnout, which is spoken about all the time amongst autistic people. Researcher Dora Raymaker, who is autistic themselves, has done some excellent qualitative research into autistic people's experience of burnout. Although autistic adults often discuss experiencing autistic burnout and attribute serious negative outcomes to it, the concept is almost completely absent from the academic and clinical literature. Autistic burnout describes when an autistic person might experience chronic exhaustion, they may lose skills and have reduced tolerance to stimulus. If you're in burnout, it may affect every part of your life, and it usually lasts for a long time, 3 months or more. It happens as a result of chronic life stress and a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports. Now, this is obviously not a trait as such, it's more of a sign that an autistic person has had unmet needs over a prolonged period of time and is in distress. However, maybe it would be useful to have something in there about it, because I do imagine a lot of people who seek a diagnosis are probably seeking it because they have reached a crisis point and they need help. Maybe they've had to drop out of education, or they've had to stop work because they're in autistic burnout. For me, I had to drop out of education when I was 17 due to autistic burnout, and I've only recently got myself back in. I'm doing a psychology degree via home study now, distance learning, but yeah, I've never managed to quite drag myself back there. And autistic burnout does often happen after puberty or after graduation from secondary education. I think it's just that the pressures of life and the things that are expected of you can just exceed your capacity, which is something that is acknowledged in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria actually. I did go and see medical professionals around that time in my life when I was in distress, and if there had been more knowledge of autistic burnout, maybe I would have been able to get my diagnosis then, almost 10 years earlier would have been super helpful, but never mind, we move. Aside from generally the fact that symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning, the only other area where I feel like autistic burnout is kind of alluded to is at the bottom of the criteria. It says you can diagnose a person as ASD with catatonia. Catatonia is a psychomotor disturbance which affects a person's ability to speak, move, or respond. It can cause things like difficulty crossing thresholds and completing movements. And I can definitely see crossovers and similarities with my own burnout. Before I got to crisis point and had to drop out, I would get off the college bus and I remember thinking I do not have the energy to get myself to the front door, and I would feel way older than I actually was, you know, like I was really having to drag my feet to get myself to the front door, and it was literally about a 2-minute walk, if that. And then I also had quite a bad period of mental health around the time that I found out that I was probably autistic. It really kind of rocked my life and made me feel a lot of things. And my husband was doing a placement for his degree and he was super busy, so he wasn't really there to offer the same amount of support as usual. And I remember going to drop off my son and then coming home, and I remember just standing at the bottom of the stairs, just looking up the stairs and thinking, right, I'm going to go up the stairs now. I need to move. I'm going to go up the stairs, and just standing there and staring. And it must have been minutes must have passed before I eventually did manage to move myself up the stairs. I just didn't have the energy to do it. So just take this, if you are an autistic person watching this, just take this as an important reminder to look after yourself. I know it can be hard in this capitalist society, but you know, for number 4, I've said issues with motor skills. So a lot of autistic people struggle with learning to ride a bike or learning to tie their shoes, and they may have a diagnosis of dyspraxia as well as autism, sometimes called developmental coordination disorder, which is a diagnosis that I have been given as well. If you've not seen the clips of me epically failing at PE at school, you're in for a treat. So dyspraxia is thought to be a neurological condition which affects your physical coordination. But according to the Dyspraxia Foundation, around 10% of people with a dyspraxia diagnosis show signs of autism, whereas 80% of children with autism have movement difficulties consistent with a diagnosis of dyspraxia. And there are numerous studies which suggest that dyspraxia could be a core feature of autism itself. In my video about the theory of monotropism, which is my favorite theory, my favorite way to describe autism, I spoke about why I thought so many autistic people might have this dyspraxia diagnosis as well and might struggle with movement. That makes sense to me through a monotropic lens, because movements, and particularly learning new movements, involves coordinating different parts of your body and making them do different things at the same time. But maybe it is kind of in our best interest to have them listed as 2 separate conditions when it comes to accessing support. Maybe it just makes it kind of clearer and is an easier way to express to somebody that, yes, I do have these differences with movement. That's why I'm so bad at PE. Please be nice to me and don't shout at me and tell me I'm not trying, which happened to me quite a lot. Maybe it's a bit similar to how differences with our attention can be seen as quite inherent to autism. You know, the DSM-5 does describe having intense interests and abnormal focus on these interests. Still, a lot of autistic people are diagnosed with ADHD as well. In the past, you could only be diagnosed with one or the other, but now you can be diagnosed with both. An estimated 30 to 80% of children with autism also meet the criteria for ADHD, and 20 to 50% of children with ADHD meet the criteria for autism as well. So scientists are sometimes looking for this kind of common biological root between the two, but it's just really complicated, I think, and we can't quite figure out, you know, where autism ends and ADHD begins, and are we looking at 2 things that just can present similarly, or are we looking at the same thing, basically, kind of, but like different presentations of the same thing? I don't know, it's really confusing. At number 5, I have autistic inertia. Some people might feel that the DSM-5 describing difficulties with transitions is sufficient enough to kind of include this one. Maybe it is, I don't know. But as a 2023 study states, although autistic inertia is a part of the autistic community's everyday lexicon, it has received scant attention in the academic literature. So autistic inertia comes from Newton's law of inertia. An object at rest stays at rest, an object at motion stays in motion at a constant velocity unless that state is changed by a force. And apparently the term inertia was adopted by the autistic community in the 1990s, so it's not new. But in this 2023 study, autistic inertia was described as being like one of the most disabling parts of being autistic. I might kind of agree with that. I think if I lived alone, it would be pretty difficult for me to stop what I was doing and remember to go and feed myself. I was thinking about that the other day. I've never lived alone. I was like, I wonder how I would cope with that. I think eating enough food would definitely be one of my major struggles if I had nobody to ever interrupt me and remind me to go and do something else. As much as I hate interruptions, I feel like I need it sometimes. So autistic people can really struggle with getting started with tasks. You may find that you sit in a car for ages when you arrive somewhere, or you might find it very difficult to get out of bed in the morning. But then also once we've started something, particularly when it's an interest, when it's something we're hyperfixated on, it can be really difficult for us to stop, and then that's when we can forget that we have other bodily functions and to forget to look after ourselves or to clean our house and things like that that are also important to do in life. Someone described being in that hyper-focused state as like riding a bike down a very steep hill. You just keep going, not eating, not drinking, trying to avoid going to the toilet, overriding everything, not being aware of time passing. I think that's an excellent description of what it's like. So this is kind of alluded to in the DSM-5 with highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. But maybe if this description of autistic inertia was more explicit in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, more people might be able to see themselves in it and get diagnosed. Hatred for interruptions would probably be a good point to include there too. Number 6 is masking. So masking is acknowledged in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. It says at the end, may be masked by learned strategies in later life. And that's really great. That's really helpful for autistic adults who are seeking a diagnosis, because obviously autistic people, we can pick up skills, we can learn, we can grow. We're not always going to present in exactly the same way we did as children. But one thing that does surprise me about the DSM-5 is how socially focused it is. When I've spent some time away from it, I'm like, oh yeah. In order to be diagnosed with ASD, you have to fit all 3 of the first criteria, which are all connected to social difficulties or deficits, as it calls it. Now, obviously, you know, socializing is typically pretty hard for autistic people, and I'm not saying we don't have difficulties with socializing. Even the people who do mask being autistic are still going to struggle socially. Masking doesn't mean that socializing is coming easily to you on the inside, but you may appear more competent than you actually are on the outside, which can be fortunate sometimes, but also unfortunate, because again, it means you can go unsupported. But I don't know, yeah, it's so weird. Like you have to fit the social criteria, but then you only need 2 out of 4 of the remaining criteria. But I don't know, the things that make me feel more autistic, I suppose, are the ability to hyper-focus and maybe my sensory experience and that kind of thing. So it's just interesting that there's such an emphasis on it. Maybe it's because I work for myself, and I have done for like the last, how long? 8-9 years. You know, like I have spent a lot less time having to socialize, and sometimes when I do, it is a bit of a shock. So maybe that's why. But yeah, every time I look at the DSM-5, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of social stuff on there. But maybe some more specifics about masking would be a good addition, because I hear from people, despite the fact that there is the bit there about learned strategies in later life, I hear from people again and again that they've been told that they didn't get a diagnosis because they seemed too sociable, because they made eye contact with this diagnostician in this one-to-one appointment setting, which is quite different from a lot of social scenarios. And also, if you're an adult, you're an adult, you've learned stuff. It doesn't say that you can't be diagnosed autistic if you make eye contact in the DSM-5. It describes abnormalities in eye contact as one example of a social difference that you might have. Some autistic people stare and make very intense eye contact because they've been told all their lives you need to make eye contact, which would be then a form of masking. And I do think a lot of medical professionals have this idea that all autistic people will have zero ability. They will not be able to learn any social skills. No matter what they go through in life, they'll have zero ability to make any friends and form any relationships. And it means that a lot of people end up slipping through the cracks. I don't say these things to put anybody off going to get a diagnosis, but I do feel like maybe at least medical professionals should be a little bit more educated about autistic masking. If you enjoyed this video, I do, as I say, have a video about signs that you're masking autism. So if you do feel like you're somebody who's a bit too social to be diagnosed as autistic, that one might be useful to you. And I also made one of 9 signs you're not autistic, which might be interesting to you as well, kind of talking a little bit about the differences between being introverted and being autistic in that one, because I'm surrounded by a lot of non-autistic introverts in my life. If you would like to support this channel, if you'd like more videos like this, if you'd like them to keep coming, then you can do so over on Patreon. And if you do, even if you join the lowest tier, which is $4 per month, you get 2 exclusive videos every month, and you also get access to the Discord server where you can chat with other neurodivergent people as well. Thank you so much, and I'll see you very soon. Bye. Also, I have snakes on my shirt, but you can't really see it. And look, it's got these little fancy, twisty, lacy I don't know what you call it. Strings. Ribbons on the arms, and you couldn't even see that either. So sorry.